right, guys, so we're going to finish off food policy in this very short period of time, I hope. Um, a couple of other things. We talked about food programs, we've talked about food deserts, and now we need to talk a little bit about food supply and then farming and how the government handles that in addition to the other side of kind of nutrition and other food issues. So one of the big parts of that is, of course, regulating the food supply for both safety and nutrition. There are really kind of three big pieces of that. One is dealing with food additives, and you guys probably hear some about this when it comes to foods that are organic versus foods that have been produced with pesticides or other synthetic food management chemicals, right? And not just for growing, not just chemicals for growing food, but also chemicals used during food preservation and processing, and added to food during the production process, right? Typically what the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is responsible for this particular piece of work, just like we often think of them only as drugs, but right, that first part of their title, food, they do take care of this as well. The standard that they used is if the scientific research suggests that a chemical is generally recognized as safe, then it is typically going to be approved by the FDA for use in both food production and food growing and preservation. So that's going to be the standard that's used throughout. A second and kind of related matter is food safety. That's also an FDA issue. When we're talking about food safety, we could be talking about a number of things, right? We could be talking about your standard inspections, which happen on a regular basis, inspections of crop production, inspections of livestock production, but also inspections of food processing and production facilities, right, to make sure that food is being processed in a very clean and safe environment to avoid contamination, much the same way we have restaurant inspections by state public health boards. Very similar thing that the FDA and the USDA work together to do. In addition to that, one of the things that we don't think of as food safety maybe, but definitely think of as nutrition, is labeling. So how are foods labeled? How do we know what's in the food? And how do we know what the nutritional value of that is? But also how it was processed, right? So sometimes you'll read a label and it'll say, this was processed in a facility that also processes tree nuts, right? That's in order to protect individuals that have nut allergies from eating foods that may have been contaminated by dust or by particles from that nut production, right? So that's an example of the kind of inspection and labeling that's going to go on. One kind of interesting note, you may not know this, there's no uniform labeling convention for when foods are going to spoil or go bad. So you'll see different types of language on food labels, right? Sometimes it's best by, sometimes it's no longer good as of whatever date, dispose of by a certain date, right? So they're all kind of different and they suggest different things. Is it that you can't consume this food after this particular date, or you can, but it's not going to taste very good, or it may be stale, or that sort of thing? Interestingly enough, there's no national standard for that labeling. Those determinations are made at the state level. So different companies may have different labeling conventions depending on where their processing facilities are located and what state law allows them to get away with. So labeling is both for your protection for consumption, but also for your nutritional information. And the FDA and the USDA handle both of those, again, together. Most of the time when we see recalls, it's over things that are easily spoiled, like meat, but also eggs and peanut butters very commonly get recalled because of it's easy for contaminants to enter the production process or the processing of those foods. We, of course, often see E. coli recalls on lettuce. and other produce, but lettuce mainly. There's one right now on romaine. The USDA has said don't eat romaine lettuce right now. That's because feces and other dirts that can contain bacteria end up on those, caught in those leaves of lettuce, right? And even though it's washed when it's processed, you'll often find that it's not completely decontaminated, and E. coli can easily enter the food system in that way. So there are recalls. The USDA will force the producer to take that back. The cost in that case is always on the producer or the processing company, not on the farmer, and not on the government, right? So those costs are borne by those processing facilities. Most contamination that we see is the result of corporate manufacturing and mass production farming, rather. So if you're doing mass production, it's just you're more likely to have something bad happen and enter the system, right? So that's what we're talking about with regards to food contamination. The third issue when we talk about regulation of food supply is this idea of genetically engineered foods. And again, just as with food safety, the USDA and the FDA work on this together. The USDA actually has the approval authority over new crops. So if a farmer wants to introduce, or not a farmer, an agribusiness company wants to introduce some kind of new genetically engineered food, the USDA does have to approve that, just like the FDA would approve a drug. However, we do not require labeling for genetically modified foods. That labeling is voluntary, okay? Genetic engineering of foods really started in the mid-1990s, and the idea is that you manipulate the genes of one species to another to create a trait that previously didn't exist in the food. As a result, crops that are genetically engineered or modified are technically not considered as foods. The USDA registers them as pesticides, right? So even though it's a food product. The European Union does require labeling of genetically engineered or genetically modified foods, and so does Australia and New Zealand. The real problem with genetically modified or genetically engineered foods, we don't really have great science on how safe they are for you from a health perspective. But we do know that they can cause kind of havoc on farming. And here's how. So what happens is there are two companies that dominate the food seed industry. Monsanto is one and DuPont is the other. So what happens when Monsanto and DuPont genetically modify a seed, for example? Let's say they genetically modify corn seed to be resistant to a particular type of contaminant, okay? Or to be resistant to or a particular type of pesticide, okay? Like Roundup is one that's kind of been controversial. Okay, so Roundup kills weeds among crops, but it doesn't kill crops. So let's say they've genetically modified that seed, okay? So what happens then is when farmers buy those genetically modified seeds, they enter into a contract with Monsanto or DuPont, whoever sells them the GM seeds, right? That dictates when the crop can be grown and how it can be grown. Because those two companies have sort of a duopoly on the seed industry. So they're able to extract from farmers guarantees about production, right? They want the production of that seed to be successful. Okay, so they're going to want them to grow it in the best conditions possible so that it can be successful and that it can develop appropriately based on the traits they've introduced in the seed. Okay, so that also prevents the farmers or the production companies from saving seeds, right? So they have to plant all the seeds that they get, or they have to throw them out. They can't save them, and contract also dictates that. So that means they're going to have to buy new seed every single year. Additionally, farmers who don't use those particular seeds still end up fighting those companies, because what happens is pollen drift can contaminate neighboring farms, right? So let's say that you have a crop that's been made Roundup resistant, and that pollen drifts over and contaminates the farm next door, and when he goes to use Roundup or a particular pesticide or whatever it is, it won't work. And now his crop is ruined because he hasn't bought the genetically modified seed, and therefore can't tend to his crops in the way that he normally does, right? And he's probably already sunk cost in the pesticide and the weed killers and everything else that he uses, and so he's kind of screwed, right? There's a big deal in Arkansas right now over some of this as well, about using particular types of pesticides, and some farmers are breaking the law and still using those pesticides, and others are not. But what's happening is this pollen drift that is affecting those farmers who are trying to follow the law, and are trying to not get caught up in this contract business with these big agricultural industry companies like Monsanto and like DuPont, right? So this is a kind of a big deal for farmers, and you'll often see farmers kind of getting into heated discussions depending on their methods, what they use to grow, what they grow, whether they've contracted with one of these two big firms or not. It becomes a very contentious topic. One more thing, back to food safety and labeling. One of the things I kind of talked about organic mainly, but or nutrition stuff, but there are all kinds of labeling issues here. You'll see products labeled as fair trade or free trade products, free farmed, hormone free, raised without antibiotics, free range, all natural. It's really hard for the FDA and the USDA to police all of those labels, but they have started to develop very clear guidelines for when you can label a food organic, and when you can label a food hormone free, and when you can label a food all natural, right? The problem is that requires that you do those inspections of those facilities or those farms to make sure that in fact that the companies that are producing foods with those labels are sticking to that over a long period of time. So let's briefly go over this idea of food supply and distribution when it comes to farms, and then in the next little chunk of lecture I'll talk specifically about different types of food subsidies, farm subsidies rather. Farm subsidies are basically when the government underwrites farmers. Big family farms, a little bit. Big corporate farms, a lot, typically. So you'll see some discussion of whether or not large-scale commercial farms are better supported than family farmers. How and when do we support different types of producers, like organic producers, and how does that affect local and regional food systems? But make no mistake about it, this is a huge issue, because subsidies really start to determine decision-making on farmers' decision-making on what they're going to grow, when they're going to grow it, and how they're going to grow it, right? So those are big kind of limitations on a farmer's choices about what they're going to do, right? Farm subsidies also include crop insurance, and then, of course, they have a direct impact on prices and international trade. A good site to kind of help you understand farm subsidies, I love the EWG Farm Subsidy Database. You can click on a state and it tracks farm subsidy payments between 1995 and 2017, so it updates every year. So you can click on a state and kind of get an idea of what types of farm subsidies entered the state and how much from 1995 through the current year for which they have data. And you can kind of see the different types of programs, farm subsidy programs, that were used in a particular state. Food prices are, of course, affected by these subsidies, right? And so that's a big deal. We don't have direct regulation on food prices, but obviously they are impacted by the types of production and the timing of production. The Farm Bill is what we typically call the piece of legislation that dictates these things, farm subsidies, and then affects food prices. So we're going to talk in depth next about the Farm Bill and the types of subsidies included in that Farm Bill.